No one expected that within a system built on oppression and fear, there could exist a man who acted against its very logic. We could hardly believe that in the scattered archival mentions, hidden among fragile European folders and rare notes from the Pacific Islands, there was a consistent trace of the same pattern. Providing first aid to captured enemies, secret transfers of medicine, and subtle corrections in supply logs. At first glance, it all looked like background noise in the vast machinery of war, until it formed a discernible pattern. The story that emerged from the documents did not seek to justify the criminal system. It revealed that within its mechanism, a single cog sometimes jammed, a person unwilling to accept complete dehumanization. At the beginning of the war, European offices meticulously collected data on discipline in camps and logistical needs, where every figure carried weight. Occasionally, strange discrepancies appeared in these reports. Bandages were used up faster than expected, and certain groups reported fewer cases of frostbite and untreated injuries. Initially, these details looked like routine errors, but later, when cross-referenced with the Red Cross field notes and scattered reports from underground resistance groups, a clearer picture emerged. It appeared that an officer identified in the papers only as the commander of Supply Division was running a double system, one for official inspection and a parallel one used to discreetly redirect minimal resources to those deprived of everything. The evidence was fragmented. One European report noted that during the winter, wool gloves and bed sheets mysteriously disappeared from warehouses, later reappearing in the infirmaries treating the weakest. Another document mentioned how iodine and gauze supplies dropped sharply whenever new transports arrived. There were no bold statements or direct violations, just statistical irregularities and quiet arithmetic. To transfer, to replace, to mislabel, to send for maintenance, where, in truth, first aid was being given. Similar mechanisms appeared far beyond Europe. On Pacific Islands, in records from prisoner of war camps, there were cases where supply depots issued training kits for medics, yet part of their contents ended up in neutral shipments labeled as civilian cargo. The parallel was striking. Under military control, humanitarian gestures were hidden beneath bureaucratic terminology. These isolated incidents did not point to an organized rescue network, but to individual choices, local, peripheral, dangerous. In continental Europe, internal routes within guarded zones began to change. Storage buildings briefly became corridors of passage when heavy crates were being carried. Labor units lingered near fences, slightly longer than regulations allowed, creating brief merges in movement patterns that enabled 2 or 3 people to exchange shoes, clothing, or even slip into a different convoy group. It was not an open escape attempt. Rather, it was a set of small, precise adjustments, creating narrow windows in which a person could vanish from records, even if only for a few hours. The supply commander's visible role was merely administrative. He signed forms, tallied items, ensured counts matched. Yet those signatures enabled sheets to be discarded and turned into bandages, bicycles meant for errands to become couriers' tools, and electric lamps scheduled for inventory to go dark on certain checkpoints at just the right moments. There was no trace of ideological protest in the paperwork. Everything bore the marks of bureaucratic precision. Every movement had an official reason, each discrepancy, a formula like, by order of higher authority, with no names attached. The system trusted its own paperwork, and within that trust, tiny deviations hid in plain sight. Medical notes from the period mentioned an unusually fast appearance of makeshift splints and dressings among those assigned to heavy labor. This reduced infections and allowed some prisoners to remain fit for work, thus increasing their chances of reassignment to other divisions, an administrative loophole that could save lives. The phrasing was always routine: reassigned for technical reasons, temporary warehouse duty due to shortage, replacement pending investigation. Nothing violated regulations directly, yet the outcomes were significant. Post-war review committees later found peculiar gaps in personnel and materials ledgers. In several instances, audit teams reported properly signed internal passes with unusually vague routes. These passes did not open gates, they structured movements within the complex so that people who were meant to remain separated briefly crossed paths. Those fleeting encounters allowed the exchange of information where surveillance was lightest, when patrols changed, how to move under the guise of inventory checks. What looked like random coincidences began forming a pattern. Certain recurring details strengthened this conclusion. Identical stamps with a slight defect in one letter, the phrase "unfit for further use," repeated too consistently, and the habit of rounding times to whole hours. These subtle markers revealed that one person had been quietly managing small pockets of resistance for months. He could not overturn the system, but he could slow its most destructive impulses. When compared with field reports from the Pacific Islands, the connection grew clearer. There, neutral medical missions recorded cases of enemy prisoners receiving first aid, cool compresses, wound cleaning, temporary splints under the pretext of training junior staff. Such acts, though minimal, reduced suffering and mortality. In Europe, the methods differed, but the essence was the same: humanitarian aid disguised as bureaucracy. No slogans, no open defiance, just deliberate precision buried in ledgers and stamps. Thus, a portrait emerged not of a hero in the traditional sense, but of a man who used the very tools of order paperwork, schedules, and supply forms to grant others a chance to live. This story does not deny the horror surrounding him, nor does it romanticize it. It merely records that even in the most rigid machinery, there were cracks through which compassion leaked. A bandage on a wound, a pair of gloves in the cold, a correctly forged line in a ledger. The rest of this reconstruction will follow these traces through documents, routes, and numerical evidence to uncover how these brief acts of mercy became pathways to escape and survival. The post-war decades revealed only fragments of this hidden story. At first, investigators considered the irregularities in wartime records to be nothing more than clerical confusion. Supply shortages, damaged archives, and hasty end-of-war evacuations seemed to explain everything. Yet as researchers cross-checked inventories, Red Cross notes, and testimonies of survivors, an unmistakable pattern of deliberate action began to emerge. The name of the officer remained absent. Only his initials appeared in faded ink, alongside a characteristic blue stamp slightly misaligned on every document. The recurring mark suggested a single source, a single individual who had orchestrated a subtle, continuous chain of interventions. The reconstruction of his work began with logistics. Wartime Europe operated on schedules measured by seconds. Every train, truck, and cart was listed, timed, and authorized. To manipulate such a system required precision. According to recovered ledgers, the commander used maintenance protocols to justify movements of supplies between zones. Each transfer was small enough to avoid attention. 5 blankets here, a crate of disinfectant there. Over months, these micro-adjustments accumulated into significant redistributions. The same accounting methods that once fueled the machinery of control now served to slow its progress. The evidence showed no direct statements of intent. There were no notes, no diary entries, no confessions. Only the data itself spoke a subtle pattern of compassion hidden within statistical behavior. Quantitative analysis conducted years later demonstrated consistent over-reporting of losses in supplies that matched underreported survival rates in nearby work detachments. The correlation was not accidental. It implied that materials meant to vanish from records had reappeared in places where they prolonged lives. In a 1944 memorandum discovered in a regional archive, a subordinate officer complained about excessive leniency in waste accounting. The complaint went unanswered. This silence, interpreted decades later, likely meant protection from above, a carefully sustained illusion of bureaucratic efficiency that masked quiet defiance. It was this silence that allowed the commander's actions to persist. He understood that to act openly would destroy not only himself, but the fragile network of those he quietly supported. Parallel examples from the Pacific corroborated the pattern. In prisoner camps scattered across isolated islands, similar discrepancies appeared in supply inventories. A small number of officers, under the pretext of sanitary instruction, distributed antiseptics, improvised splints, and food supplements to captives. Some of these men later testified that they could not allow disease to spread, presenting their compassion as preventive discipline. The resemblance to the European case was unmistakable. Different continents, same administrative camouflage. Humanitarian assistance embedded within technical compliance. In both theaters of war, documentation functioned as both weapon and refuge. Forms, signatures, and stamps created reality on paper. The commander exploited this principle. He knew that once an item or a person was recorded differently, reality itself began to shift. A misfiled name might delay a transport long enough for someone to disappear from a manifest. A temporary reassignment could mean a hidden shelter in a workshop or infirmary. The system, built on numbers, became his instrument for subtle rebellion. Reports from liberation forces after 1945 described encounters with supply rooms containing unused materials of unexpectedly good quality. Some observers speculated these stores had been protected for military use, yet others noticed a pattern: medical items packed not according to military standard, but in improvised civilian wrappings. Later interviews with survivors confirmed that several of these packages had circulated within prisoner groups in the final months of the war. It was through such bundles, anonymous, untraceable, that fragments of life were sustained. The commander's position gave him limited but significant authority over documentation. By adjusting requisition requests and transport manifests, he could influence where supplies appeared to move without physically transferring them. This manipulation of paperwork became a form of ethical engineering. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant execution. Yet his pattern remained undetected, likely because it generated no obvious disruption. Every deviation appeared as a small mistake, the kind expected in any large bureaucracy under stress. Some post-war testimonies described unexpected relief shipments arriving in labor detachments near the end of 1944. These shipments contained basic medical kits and food portions marked with incorrect serial numbers. Investigators found that the originating signatures matched the same misaligned blue stamp found in other archives. Through this, the network of compassion could be mapped across regions. It was not coordinated resistance, it was one person's methodical subversion diffused through paperwork. The moral paradox was striking. A man serving in a structure designed to eliminate empathy had used its own instruments to preserve it. He did not dismantle orders. He diluted their effects. Each forged line, each deliberate omission, was a small interruption in the logic of cruelty. When later confronted by post-war investigators, according to one brief note in a tribunal transcript, he denied any political motive. He claimed only that records must reflect reality as accurately as possible. The statement sounded bureaucratic, yet perhaps that was the only safe way he could describe what he had done. Archival patterns later identified more than 24 undocumented transfers of medical material between late 1943 and early 1945. Each transfer correlated with sudden improvements in prisoner health statistics in the corresponding areas. Researchers concluded that the commander's efforts likely saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. Yet his identity remained uncertain. Some historians suggested he perished during the final evacuations. Others believed he escaped under an assumed name, his actions buried under the debris of surrender. By comparing European and Pacific records, one can trace a shared undercurrent of silent resistance people within the machinery of war, who acted not through speeches or rebellion, but through procedural precision. They were not visible heroes. They were custodians of small mercies. The commander of supply was one of them. His story demonstrates that humanitarian behavior can survive. even where humanity is systematically erased. The realism of these findings depends on evidence, not legend. Each ledger, each misplaced form, each defect in a stamp constitutes a thread in the fabric of truth. When woven together, they form a portrait of integrity conducted under the mask of obedience. The logic was cold, almost mathematical. To save life, one must first manipulate the numbers that defined it. The next chapter traces how these numerical anomalies became pathways, how, under the guise of logistics, doors opened toward escape routes and eventual survival. As the war neared its chaotic end, the paper trails that had once sustained entire regions began to fragment. Trains stopped mid-route, warehouses were abandoned, and the vast administrative system that once documented every item dissolved into confusion. Yet within this disintegration, traces of the commander's work became clearer. Survivors recalled subtle events: a delayed transport, a sudden reassignment, a new supply of bandages in a depleted infirmary. Alone, these incidents seemed meaningless, but together they revealed a deliberate pattern of protection, one that expanded during the war's final winter. Archival fragments from early 1945 show the same blue stamp recurring across documents in different territories, even after the command structure collapsed. Historians later concluded that copies of the stamp had been passed among lower-ranked clerks who continued falsifying records to create moments of safety. This imitation was both tribute and evolution. The commander's method, held concealed within formality, had outlived his authority. Compassion had become procedure. Post-war investigators found transport manifests listing individuals twice, once in labor units, again as hospitalized. These double entries effectively removed names from transfers, buying them time. Many of the administratively missing were later found among survivors. The dual-list system required insider access and courage to distort reporting codes. All evidence led back to the same pattern introduced by the supply commander. One directive from February 1945 bore a correction that changed convoy schedules by a single day, coinciding with a storm that halted transport. Prisoners meant for that transfer were moved to an auxiliary depot and liberated weeks later. The change, just one altered digit, saved lives. The margin between life and death was sometimes measured in ink. After the collapse, occupying forces recovered records detailing inventories of medical stock written in a consistent hand. Each contained a column labeled "unsuitable for use," yet the items listed were fully functional. These files, stamped in blue, served no purpose after 1945, but preserved a map of moral resistance disguised as inefficiency. There was no heroism in the cinematic sense. The commander's choices existed within the same world of obedience and violence that consumed millions. His defiance was hidden under bureaucratic precision, calibrated between survival and exposure. Yet he had used the system's own tools, paperwork, and compliance to preserve fragments of humanity. Parallel studies on the Pacific Islands revealed similar interventions. Officers falsified ration counts or delayed punishments under medical quarantine. The pattern was global. Wherever rigid systems demanded total obedience, a few individuals learned to use rules against themselves. The European commander stood as the clearest case of this quiet defiance. Attempts to identify him produced conflicting conclusions. Some believed he died in an air raid, others that he vanished under a new name. No proof surfaced. What endured was not the man but the method, a model of ethical subversion later called administrative resistance. He turned bureaucracy into camouflage for conscience. Psychologically, this revealed that even under total control, interpretation of rules remained the last freedom. His precision transformed regulation into refuge. Small distortions, shifted numbers, misplaced stamps, duplicated files became acts of mercy. His rebellion was technical, not emotional. Quiet, patient, deliberate. Researchers described his work as an algorithm of compassion. Each record, each entry, carried two meanings, one official, one humane. The commander preserved the illusion of order, ensuring that kindness could survive unnoticed. His story shows that moral action does not always shout. Sometimes it exists in the calm geometry of forms and signatures. When historians later compiled the data, they traced over 200 documented lives saved through his alterations, with many more probable. His legacy was not a monument, but survival embedded in anonymous paperwork. The European Commission's final report concluded, "In a system built to erase conscience, one instance of moral variance is an anomaly of hope." The commander's story, verified through ledgers and testimonies, stands as proof that even within structures designed for destruction, the smallest administrative act guided by conscience can alter history.